Final Fantasy 16 and 7 Rebirth both sold millions of copies, and that should be a huge win. But thanks to ballooning budgets and massive marketing spend, Square Enix actually ended up disappointed with the performance of both games. So what does this mean for the future of the franchise, and how can Square balance business with creativity going forward? And what lessons might they learn from surprise hits like Expedition 33? Well, let's unpack. Now, first off, let's start with some context. So, Final Fantasy 16 released in 2023 and shipped over 3 million units in its very first week. An impressive feat, I would say, by any metric, and yet Square were not satisfied. And that's largely down to the fact that the budget was a whopping $59 million, a huge number for a single game, and that doesn't even factor in the marketing costs, and although we don't know what they were, it is at least expected that they doubled, if not tripled, that game budget. And then when you factor in distribution costs on top of everything else, you're probably looking at over $300 million just to break even. Yeah, all of a sudden 3 million units shipped doesn't sound that impressive. Then came 7 Rebirth, and to my knowledge, Square never publicly disclosed their budget figures for this game, which makes me suspect they were at least similar, if not greater than what we saw with Final Fantasy 16. Unfortunately, sales again failed to impress Square, with 2 million copies being sold for PS5, approximately half the amount as was sold for Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a Final Fantasy game may sound obscene, but this is actually nothing new to Square. In fact, the original Final Fantasy VII, which released in 1997, had a budget and spend of about 80 million, which when adjusted for inflation is pretty much competitive with what they're spending on their games today. And FF7 is still the best-selling Final Fantasy game to date, so it's clear to me that Square wants to try and recapture some of that old magic. However, not only have gamers changed over the last 28 years since that time, but gaming itself is almost radically different than what it was back then. Nowadays, we are absolutely spoilt for choice when it comes to AAA gaming franchises, so every time Square are putting out a brand new Final Fantasy game, they're having to work harder and harder for that game to stand out in a crowded marketplace. Now, with these increased challenges of production of its AAA games, Square Enix has publicly stated that its strategy needs urgent review. In other words, it hasn't quite got the right balance between business versus creative. So have we hit the point where Final Fantasy can't justify its own scale anymore? And if that is the case, then what does that mean at the bottom line for us as gamers, and what can we expect going forward with newer Final Fantasy releases? Well, of course, the good news is, if Square Enix decide to cut their costs, that smaller budget doesn't have to translate to less impressive games. And I would be very surprised if Square aren't keeping a close eye on the recently released Expedition 33, a game that many would say, and I agree with this, feels like a true successor to classic Final Fantasy games, and yet, despite its AAA design, was created with a lot less money spent and with a development team of about 30 people. Now, yes, there was some outsourcing as well, but the point is the overall spend has been far more realistic and contained. And what's the result? Well, it's now just been announced that Expedition 33 has sold over 1 million copies, and that may not sound as impressive as the 2 million for Rebirth over around the same period, or the 3 million for FF16 over the same period. But when you factor in the lower costs in making the game, it's actually going to end up more profitable than either of those Final Fantasy entries. But what's most interesting to me is on the creativity side, because starting with Final Fantasy 15, Square Enix came to the decision that they need to abandon traditional turn-based combat entirely in their later Final Fantasy games in favour of, more Devil May Cry style action. Now sure, I do recognise that FF7 Remake and Rebirth are more hybrid in their gameplay, but yet they still are heavily focused on the real-time and flashy aspects. And presumably, Square made this decision because they need to appeal to a modern action-focused audience and capture the largest part of the market. But long-time fans, such as myself and others, I know many of you around this channel would agree with this, we miss the tactical pacing and party management that define classic Final Fantasy. Now, as I've said that, I can definitely hear some of you furiously typing in the comments section to remind me that the Final Fantasy franchise has always been about innovation and moving forward with each game. But I think that would be a misunderstanding, because actually I would agree. We do want our Final Fantasy games to innovate. That is very much a hallmark of the franchise. That innovation is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's just important that any changes are respectful of the original roots. And I have every sympathy with Square in trying to balance that tightrope of old and new. However, unfortunately, I do think they've missed the mark a little bit in going too heavily focused on that action-oriented side. And this is where I think, going forward, that lessons can be learned from Expedition 33, which we could say is innovation done right. As I mentioned, this game only had a smaller indie-style development team of around 30 devs, and yet they managed to create something really special with actually a particularly strong Final Fantasy energy to it. But this isn't simply a modern-looking classic Final Fantasy game. It does have that turn-based combat, but it has fused it with dynamic elements such as timed inputs and cinematic presentation. And the game even manages to utilise quick-time events in a manner that feels good. So whereas the new Final Fantasy games are really now just action games with a veneer of what came before on top, Expedition 33 has really taken the opposite approach. It's kept what made those games classics core and central. And then keeping that at the base of its philosophy, it's then not being afraid to innovate and take things a little bit further. And so now what we have is gorgeous art direction, stylised animations, a deep emotional tone, and it's no surprise to me that this game has been compared to Final Fantasy X, more like an evolved Final Fantasy X. It's been critically acclaimed, and what I think is most interesting here is that it has been praised specifically by fans and critics for its combat systems, which to me clearly shows there's a huge appetite for this kind of experience, especially among Final Fantasy fans. You know, Expedition 33 didn't need a $60 million budget in order to do well, and it is doing very well. It just needed the right design vision. Now, as I mentioned, I'm absolutely convinced that Square, behind the scenes, are going to be watching this game very closely so that they can learn perhaps some lessons going forward with their own Final Fantasy franchise. And yes, this is where I have to speculate a little bit, but here's a possible future, maybe for Final Fantasy 17, or depending on what they've already worked on with that game, what comes next. We may be looking at smaller, more focused mainline entries with hybrid combat, but not hybrid in the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth sense, but more in the Expedition 33 sense, with turn-based still being the foundation. We may be looking at lower risk spin-offs of the Final Fantasy games with more classic mechanics, and I'm looking forward to the announcement of Final Fantasy IX Remake, which we're expecting any time now, as we do expect that to be honouring the combat type, the turn-based combat type of Final Fantasy IX, and I'm sure Square will want to see how that performs in the context of the things we've been discussing. But I do think it's very possible that Final Fantasy XVII could offer a more classic tactical-based adventure. But what is very clear is that Square Enix is at a crossroads, and that big budgets don't guarantee big success anymore, not like it once did, and trying to please everyone might end up pleasing no one. Expedition 33 has proven there can be another way forward, less bloat, more focus, and combat that honours the past while still bringing in new elements into the present. But what do you want Final Fantasy XVII to look like? Turn-based revival or full-on action? Somewhere in between? Please do share your own thoughts. But I do hope you found this commentary interesting, at least, even if you disagree with some of the conclusions that I've drawn. I'm happy for you to, be part of the conversation, so please do use the comments section. And if you want to hear more from me, then do go ahead and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.